And then, hey, Will, would you go ahead and open us up in prayer?
Yes.
All right, thanks,
Right.
Will.
Lord, we thank you very much that we can be here this evening, that that you desire to teach us about you and reveal things about yourself to us, Father. And we thank you that you've given us minds to be able to understand this, and at least been enough patience to come and teach it to us. So we thank you for that. Be with him as he's talking tonight. Be with us as we try to process the information. And thank you for being a wonderful God. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Amen. All right, guys. Well, hey, welcome back. I know we had a week off last week, and hope you all had a good time just relaxing with the one you love, or just if not, just relaxing and not having a night where you are just your mind melts from all these apologetics. So, just as review from the last time we met, remember that we talked about knowledge, epistemology, and evidence, and we talked about Reformed epistemology and covenantal epistemology. So if none of these are ringing a bell, if you can't really give me a one sentence definition of all these ideas, make sure you go back and listen to that. We do have the class up, both on my website, and it's on YouTube. So, and it should be on the thread. So we talked about the problem of certainty, how there's two types of certainty: logical certainty and moral or psychological certainty, and how really when we're talking about ideas of proving God's existence and having this conversation of certainty, we aren't always logically certain about these things, but we can have a good deal of moral or psychological certainty, connected to our beliefs. And so it's interesting. There's someone who has actually been watching our videos out in Arizona. He emailed me last week, and he was talking to me about this, and wanted to know more about moral and psychological certainty and what that looks like. He's not a Christian, so but he's asking some good questions. So it's really neat to see our little ministry having effect on people in other parts of the world. And then we talked about certainty in natural theology. What does that mean when we make arguments about God's existence, when we try to use our rational faculties to talk about God? Well, it means that arguments aren't coercive. And that's kind of leading us into this week, because this week we're going to talk about the theological arguments. I'm going to give you um, four primary arguments. I thought I was going to do five, but I wanted to do four. Now, the fourth one, it actually has a form that we can break it up into many different arguments, and I'll show you what that means. But oh, come on. There we go. All right. So the agenda tonight is we're going to, in talking about theistic arguments, we're going to talk about structure of logical arguments very briefly. I don't know if any of you have ever taken a class in logic before, but I do want to talk to you about how arguments are constructed, what premises are, what a conclusion is, stuff like that. We're going to talk about how we judge logical arguments. So whether an argument is valid, whether it is sound, whether it is cogent. We're going to look at all those things. And then we're going to talk about certain theistic arguments: the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the ontological argument. Those are really the big three that any book in apologetics that's talking about theistic arguments is going to include, those three. And then we're also going to talk about the moral argument, and I put down there and its form. The reason I put and its form on there is that the form of the moral argument, you can use it to argue a number of different things. We could do the argument of truth, we could do the argument of beauty, etc. We could argue a lot of things using this moral argument form, and they all point to God. And so that's why I put that on there, and I'll show you how to do that tonight. It's really interesting and a neat little idea. So, but that's where we're going tonight. That's what we're doing. Just the structure, the judgment, and then looking at theological or theistic arguments. So First off, what we're going to talk about tonight is the structure of logical arguments. And then in doing that, what we have to talk about is that all logical arguments are made up of two basic parts. They have premises and conclusions. All right. I'm sure you've seen, or maybe you haven't, but if you read certain philosophical texts or apologetic texts, if you read the books, sometimes you'll have these arguments where it has a P in front of it, or a sentence has a P in front of it, and then another sentence has a C in front of it. That usually stands for premise and conclusion. A premise or premises are statements used to justify an argument's conclusion. All right, they're kind of the evidence that you're building up to conclude your argument. And then a conclusion is a statement that ties together the evidence of the premises. And so I've got a little, I'm sure you've seen all have seen this before, but I've got a little argument down here at the bottom. Our first premise is that all men are mortal. Premise two is Socrates is a man. And then the conclusion there is that therefore Socrates is mortal. Or if you've seen Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, I think they call him Socrates. But yes, that is Socrates. Don't mess that up. But yes, you have two premises, and most arguments have at least two premises in there. There are only certain types of arguments. We won't get into that tonight that only have one premise, but most arguments, most logical arguments have at least two premises. All men are mortal. Are mortal is our first premise, and then our second premise is Socrates is a man. Those premises are the evidence for what we are trying to argue for. And in this argument, they necessitate our conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And so when we begin to look at the structure of an argument, everything we're going to look at tonight has a set of premises. It has different evidence that is building up to different conclusions. So it's going to be important to become familiar with this kind of structure, what these are called, the names of these parts of the arguments and what they're doing in an argument. So really big idea here. Remember what premises and conclusions are when you're building an argument. Now, further, there are different types of logical arguments that we use in philosophy and apologetics. There are two general types of logical arguments. They are called deductive and inductive. This is important because most of the time when we are talking about arguments for God's existence, we are only going to be using inductive arguments. There are very few deductive arguments, and they don't really stand up to tests. They don't really they don't last long if they are deductive in nature. Now, what does that mean? Well, a deductive argument is one that provides definitive proof for the conclusion from the premises. This is an argument that is coercive. When you put the data out there, you must believe the conclusion. There's no other way to accept it unless one of the premises is just blatantly false. And I'll show you in a little bit how you can have false premises and still have a valid argument. That does happen sometimes. So, but a deductive argument is one that provides definitive proof of the conclusion from the premises. So again, we have our first argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is a deductive argument. You are deducing from the premises a logical conclusion. And so when we talked about last week about logical certainty, this is very logically certain. All right. This is something where the premises necessitate the conclusion. There's really no wiggle room. This is a valid argument. This is a sound argument. All right. And I'll explain what those mean in a minute. But this is what deductive reasoning does. You deduce your conclusion from your premises. You kind of just go down the list and check off your evidence, and your conclusion is necessitated from the premises. Most theistic arguments are not deductive. All right. So therefore, they are not coercive. And I've talked to you guys many times about this before, how it's really hard to bring people to faith just using apologetic arguments for God's existence, because arguments for God's existence are not deductive by nature. They're not coercive. They don't necessitate that people believe in God when they look at them. All right. When you use an argument for God's existence, they are much more likely to be inductive. And there are a whole different kinds of set of problems that come with using inductive logic. So that's deductive. And we're not going to spend too much time on that, because more of what we're going to talk about is inductive reasoning, where an argument is intended to be strong enough that if the premises were true, then it is unlikely that the conclusion is false. So if the premises are true, now we still have to question whether or not the premises are true, but if they are true, then it is unlikely the conclusion is false. It's not 100% certain. There could be outliers that make the conclusion false, but it's more likely than not that the conclusion is true if the premises are true. All right. And so what do I mean by this? Here's a inductive argument that I'll use. Ben leaves for work every morning at 7 a.m. to arrive on time. That's our first premise. Our second premise is Ben left work or for work this morning at 7 a.m. And then our conclusion, therefore, Ben should arrive on time. All right. So if we look at the two premises and we evaluate them for their strength, Ben leaves for work every morning at 7 a.m. to arrive on time. I actually don't leave at 7 a.m. I leave a little earlier than that, but just for the sake of the argument, yeah, so I leave at 7 a.m. to arrive on work at time. Today I left for work this morning at 7 a.m. If these two premises hold true, then it is more likely than not that I should arrive on time at work. However, you guys have worked, all of you, I'm sure, have worked in an office setting, or you've had a job where you've kind of used this reasoning before. Why isn't Bob here? Well, Bob leaves his house every morning at this time, and he texted me this morning when he left. He should be here. Well, why isn't he here? Well, something must have happened. There are always outliers that could happen where the conclusion is false. The conclusion is not 100% necessitated from the premises of this argument. There is wiggle room. There's room for interpretation. The premises could be argued, but if they are indeed thought to be strong enough and they're thought to be truthful enough, it is more likely that the conclusion is true rather than it is false. The conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises, but we know that it is more likely for it to be true than false. So remember, logical certainty versus psychological certainty. Here, when we're using inductive arguments, we are not necessarily logically certain with our argument, but we can have a fair degree of psychological certainty. All right. So again, this is where most of our arguments, our theistic arguments, are going to fall. They're going to be using this kind of inductive reasoning where the premises can be argued whether or not they are true. And if they are found to be true and we can believe them and we think they are, credible, then it is more than likely that the conclusion is also true. So those are the two types of arguments that we use in logical reasoning. We have inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. All of the arguments we're going to look at tonight are inductive in nature. Nothing is deductive. All right. So I want to pause here. We're going to have a lot of technical information tonight, and I want to make sure that nobody just gets left behind. Is there anyone who has any questions so far? Is this pretty clear? Excuse me. I have a little bit of a cold tonight, guys, and I apologize. I'm going to take your silence to mean that this is pretty clear for us. So I will move on. So those are our types of arguments, deductive and inductive. We're mostly going to be using inductive. Now we're going to talk about how to judge logical arguments. All right. There are 3 tests for judging logical arguments. We call them validity, soundness, and cogency. All right. Two of them are for deductive arguments, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them. And then only one of them is for inductive. So two are used for deductive arguments. Validity and soundness are used for deductive arguments. And then cogency is used for inductive arguments. So validity is when the premises necessitate the truth of the conclusion. All right. Again, we have our little deductive argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. All right. If the premises necessitate the truth of the conclusion, all right, if you have no other way to get around that conclusion, that is a valid argument. This argument right here, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. We would judge that argument valid. And that's only one way we judge it, but it means that the premises necessitate the truth of the conclusion. However, if we can go to the next slide, there's also what we call soundness, when an argument is valid without having true premises, but the premises can necessitate the conclusion. So I said earlier that you can have deductive arguments where the premises are true, but they also necessitate the conclusion. That would be called an unsound argument. And so when you have deductive arguments, you want them to be both valid and sound. You don't want them to be valid or sound. You don't want one or the other. They need to be both valid and sound to be a complete and strong argument. So when an argument is valid without having true premises, but the premises can necessitate the conclusion. So if the premises are not true, then the argument is not sound. So here is a argument that is not sound, but it is valid. All men are pirates. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is a pirate. Now, this argument has two premises that necessitate the conclusion. It is a valid argument. All men are pirates. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is a pirate. That is a valid argument. However, at the same time, it's not a sound argument, because when you look at it, and both of you, I'm sure all of you are thinking this is silly, but this is one of the examples I always use when teaching this. We can definitely question the truthfulness of the premise. Are all men actually pirates? No, not all. We know that for certain. Not all men are pirates. So this argument here is not a sound argument. It's a valid argument because the premises necessitate the truth or the conclusion, but not all the premises are true. Therefore, it is not a sound argument. The argument is logically valid, but it is not sound. So that's what we have there. We have soundness and validity. Those are how we judge deductive arguments. All right. And I don't want to get hung up too much on that, because again, for theistic arguments, you're not going to run up against too many deductive arguments. There are a few, and you can judge them by using validity and soundness. Now, what we're going to talk about is cogency, which is the quality where the truth of the premises makes the conclusion more likely to be true than false. And of course, this sounds like inductive reasoning. And so if the premises are true, it is more likely the conclusion is true. All right. So here's my inductive argument. Most pirates can swim. Blackbeard was a pirate. Therefore, it is likely Blackbeard could swim. Now, notice that this argument has a little different feel to it. Already, you can see that my language has kind of changed in the conclusion. I don't make such a bold statement. I argue that therefore it is likely. To notice the passive language there. Blackbeard could swim. All right. We're saying it's more likely than not that he could swim. All right. But the premises, this is not a deductive argument. All right. The premises do not necessitate the truthfulness of the conclusion. What happens here is that we have to judge the premises each individually based on their own merit. And if it's more likely that they are true rather than false, then we could say this is a cogent argument. We could say this is a good argument. We could say it's a—
Hey, Ben.
Yes.
So this argument here, you could reference him back to you leaving for work at 7 because you want to be on time. you could then say that you would likely arrive on time as well, right? I mean, I think we could make that same assumption, based on this argument as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you notice that the language changes there a little. It's not as definitive. There's not as much logical certainty built into this type of argument. And so, yeah, again, if the premises are true, it's more likely that the conclusion is true, but it's not 100% necessary that the conclusion is true based on the premises. Most pirates can swim. Does that mean all pirates can swim? No, I don't. I'm willing to bet not all pirates could swim. All right. And we know that Blackbeard was a pirate. All right. But we don't know for sure that he could swim. But since most pirates can swim, we have a pretty good reason to believe that Blackbeard could swim. It's not 100% logically certain he could swim, but we have a pretty good estimation that he could. And so what would be involved in an argument like this, and this is what you will see throughout apologetics, throughout these kind of inductive arguments that people make based on argument for the existence of God. What you'll see is these apologists will offer just pages upon pages of evidence to support each premise of their argument, to back it up, to look for any kind of objections that people might have about each premise. And they will try to answer those objections before those objections are actually given to them. And then they will talk about how strong the premises are, the premises are related to the conclusion. And so again, this is cogency, the quality where the truth of the premises makes the conclusion more likely to be true than false. It's not 100%, but it is more likely to be true. This kind of a judgment only works in inductive arguments. I told you that already. And so, and then moving on, I did want to say one thing. I was wondering what the slide had on here. This wasn't something that I put on there earlier, but I want to say a quick word about circularity. In apologetics, some apologists have been criticized for using circularity in their arguments. This is even more true for our type of reformed apologetics, that people who come from a more theologically reformed background, where they're a little more okay in using circularity and in their arguments. And I'll explain what that means. A circular argument would operate like this. You have a premise that says the Bible is truthful because it is God's word. And our conclusion, therefore, the Bible is God's word because it is truthful. It's just one big circle. There's not really an argument being made here. They might call it a tautology or something like that, but there's a heavy degree of circularity involved here. And some apologists would not use an argument like this. They wouldn't. They would say this has no basis in reasoning. It's not logically valid. It's not sound. It's not an inductive argument. We can't necessarily judge a set of premises and come to a better conclusion. It's just not a good argument, they would say. And so they would avoid that. But some apologists are kind of coming around to using this kind of circularity, or they're at least exploring this more, because what we've noticed is that this argument is based in God's revelation and not in human rationality. And that's a big thing that we're going to talk about tonight, is that most of these arguments that we're using tonight, they're coming from human rationality. They are not necessarily based in God's revelation. And so when we talk about, if you go on and read other apologetics books after this class, if you see certain apologists who are comfortable with this type of circularity, and you may see others who are not, that's okay. What we need to understand is that some apologists are really comfortable with the idea that there are certain things that we know about God that can only be revealed to us. We cannot arrive at them with human rationality. And I've been telling you guys this from day one. This should not be like shocking to you, or this should not be, something that's brand new. We've talked about this over the course of this class, where certain apologetic approaches, they hold up human reasoning a little higher, and they want to look for evidence, where some apologetic approaches, they start at a proposition of faith and they work to better understand their faith through human reasoning. And we kind of see that there with circularity. What I don't want you to do is to walk away from this class and see an apologist that may use circular arguments and think 100% all the time this is okay. It's not always okay. Sometimes we need to stretch things a little bit. Sometimes we need to push things to better understand them with our human reasoning. At the same time, I don't want you to think that circularity is always bad. There have been, we know this argument that I use to be true because of our faith. The Bible is truthful because it's God's word. Therefore, the Bible is God's word because it's truthful. We know this to be a good argument from a faith perspective. That's not a bad thing. All right. We don't need to try to build a human rationale for the Bible's truthfulness and for the Bible being God's word. That's something that we can take on faith. That's okay. That doesn't mean we are less justified in believing that belief. There are some arguments that we just do not build off of human rationality. We have to build them off of God's revelation. So I want you to be kind of open-handed with this concept of circularity. Don't be afraid to embrace it a little bit, even though a lot of philosophers out there are scared to death of it. Don't be afraid to embrace it a little bit, but also don't be afraid to challenge it a little bit when you see it. That it's something that we need to take seriously. We need to look at and say, well, can we build a human rationale? Can we use reasoning to arrive at this conclusion? Or is this something that we have to take on faith? And I think and should Christians shy away from such arguments? I've already said, no, not necessarily, because, that argument is a statement of our faith and whatnot. So those are how we judge logical arguments, where we use validity and soundness, we use cogency, and then I told you briefly about circularity here. Are there any questions about how we judge our logical arguments before I actually move on to the theistic arguments? Because we are moving quickly tonight.
So Ben, it sounds like would the presuppositionalist be more likely to be open to a circular argument versus an evidentialist would be more likely not to, because if you presuppose the existence of God or the truth of God's word, that's more presuppositional position. Is that correct?
Absolutely, 100%, Rick. I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to sway the conversation one way or the other. But if you read John Frame's Apologetics book, which I have recommended, even though I don't agree with everything in it, he's very, very comfortable with an amount of circularity. And I think he makes some valid points about how we do have to approach certain truths of the Christian faith in this way. There's just no way around it. You can't arrive at them, through rational or man's reasoning. And there's also, we talked about covenantal epistemology last week. There's Scott Oliphant is kind of the spokesman for that epistemology out there in the academic world right now. And he's very much into, hey, we need to learn how to accept some circular thinking in our apologetics and philosophy. And there were actually, when I read that in a book most recently, and many of the people who were commenting on his essay agreed with him that it's something that we as Christians need to explore more deeply, and not be so afraid of it. So you are absolutely right, Rick. Any other questions? That's a great question. All right. I will move on. So we are, and there are some things that must be proved by God's revelation. I did have one more point on there, but we already talked about that with circularity. So moving on to theistic arguments. And so we're going to look at first the cosmological argument. This is probably the most popular argument. That is because it's the argument that was first employed by Thomas Aquinas. It's been very popular since Aquinas wrote it down in his Summa Theologica. It's if you ever get a chance to look at the Summa Theologica, it's in the first chapter on the first page where he starts making this argument, this cosmological argument. He has 5 different arguments in there, and I believe 3 or 4 of them are cosmological arguments, and one is more like a teleological argument. But anyways, this is a popular argument because also philosophers and apologists today who are very popular in Christianity still use this argument. William Lane Craig, I have mentioned him in this class numerous times. He is a big proponent on a form of this argument called the Kalam Cosmological Argument. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on this argument, I believe. And so very much has been pushing this argument for the last 50 years. But let's get into it and I'll explain how this works. This is how Aquinas argued it. I'm going to give you the most basic forms of these arguments. Please understand that I'm giving you these most basic forms so that they're not as complex as maybe some of the contemporary forms that we have out there today. So they're easier to understand, but also you need to remember that there are better, more beefed up versions of these arguments that you can go out and you can kind of research on your own after you get a basic idea of what they are tonight. So Aquinas's argument pretty much goes like this: things exist. I don't think we need to argue that. There are things exist, and so it is possible for those things not to exist. Aquinas would call this contingency or a contingent existence, something that relies on a cause of another thing for its existence. And so whatever does exist and has the possibility to not exist has been caused. All right. So I want to stop right there real quick because this can get real confusing real fast. Things exist. Let's say people exist. All right. It is possible for people not to exist. All right. That's our second point there. So the first point, people exist. Second point, it is possible for people not to exist. So whatever exists, people exist, has the possibility of not existence has been caused. So if we use people as an example in Aquinas's argument here, Aquinas is saying people have been caused because it is possible for people not to exist. All right. Then we get to there cannot be an infinite number of causes. If you go back in time and if you go back through a number of causes, take your own existence, for example. Well, I exist because I was born to my mother, and my father, and they exist because of their mothers and their fathers, and they go, you just keep going all the way back and back and back for more and more causes. But you cannot have an infinite number of causes. The causes have to stop somewhere back in the recesses of time. And so there must be an uncaused cause of things. There must be something all the way back at the beginning of these causes that has caused all these other things to come into existence. And so Aquinas would say this uncaused cause is God. So if we take people as an example in the cosmological argument, all right, and we can extrapolate this argument. Really, what he does is he extrapolates it to the universe. But let's just keep people as our example for now. People exist. It's possible that people do not exist. But if people exist and have the possibility of not existing, they have been caused. That means they are contingent beings. Therefore, there cannot be an infinite number of causes going back. You can't have an infinite number of people going back, into the recesses of time. Something had to cause people to come into existence. So there must be an uncaused cause of people coming into existence. That uncaused cause is God. And so Aquinas used this a lot for the existence of the universe. The universe, it exists. There's a possibility that the universe does not exist. And since it does exist and it can possibly not exist, it must have a cause. It cannot have an infinite number of causes. There must be something uncaused that brought the universe into existence, and that uncaused cause is God. Now, what Aquinas has done here, and if you really look at the literature supporting him and how he explains this, he explains God as a necessary being. It is necessary for God to exist. God has no cause. He is the uncaused cause, whereas like humans and the universe are contingent things. Their existence is contingent upon something else causing them. And so that's how he explains all this. But this is kind of the easy explanation of his argument, the cosmological argument. Are there any questions about this argument? I think this is an easy one to understand, but I don't want to assume that for everyone listening. Is there any way that I can better explain it for anybody who's not understanding it out there? Man, this is easy. All right. So I will take your silence to mean that you understand this. And again, we're going to have this video up so you can come back and learn about this. But every apologetic book out there that's treating a broad range of apologetics, kind of like a textbook that I've shown you Craig's book, I've shown you Nash's book. They all of these big classroom apologetic books talk about the cosmological argument. So it's I would encourage you to buy something that talks about a lot of different subjects in apologetics, a book that talks about stuff like that. It will have this argument in there, and it'll most likely have different formulations and contemporary formulations of the argument as well. So the next argument that I want to cover is called the teleological argument. And teleological is not a word that people really use today. It's something that's a little absent from our culture. What it really talks about, it's talking about purpose or design. The argument was first formulated by William Paley, or he's kind of the one who gets credit for it, using the Watchmaker analogy. Now, you've all probably come across the Watchmaker analogy before, where it talks about if you were walking in the woods one day and you came across a watch just ticking on the ground and it was working fine, your assumption would be that somebody put that watch there and somebody built that watch, that it just did not kind of pop into existence out of nowhere. The intricacy of the design, the fact that it's there and it maybe it's a little out of place, like somebody intentionally, built that watch, and maybe somebody intentionally left it there, but that's Paley's in a nutshell, that's Paley's Watchmaker analogy. And I'm sure if you've heard any arguments about God's existence, you've probably come across that Watchmaker analogy. But the argument goes like this: human artifacts are products of human design. The things that we use in our everyday life, they are products of our own design. All right. And there's really no argument there. We believe that the universe resembles an artifact. Okay. It has some of the same intricacies as how we construct things. There are, and this is really, if you dive into the science of it, it's really interesting to see just how much like our own planet has to kind of just sit on this edge of a knife to be just right in the temperature of our earth and our atmosphere, and how the world has come together just so that life can survive on our planet. And so Paley argued that the universe and all the science that they were learning about the universe at the time, the intricacies of the universe resemble an artifact that is made by humans. There are certain intricacies that point to a designer there, point to someone who has made an artifact. Therefore, the universe is a product of intelligent design. So, and this is only halfway through the argument. This is kind of a neat argument where we get to see two premises, then a conclusion, and then we'll see a couple more premises and a conclusion based on this. So, human artifacts, the things that we make, they are products of human design. The Earth or the universe resembles a human artifact. It has intricacies that look like it has been designed. Therefore, the universe is a product of intelligent design. Now, Paley builds on this. The universe is complex in comparison to human artifacts. If we think that a watch is complex, well, how much more complexity is involved in the universe coming together and the design that is involved in the universe? Therefore, it is probable there is a vastly more powerful designer involved with the creation of the universe. And nope, there's no more points there. So you can kind of see, and I didn't mention this on cosmological argument, but you can very much see how this is an inductive argument. The premises of these arguments do not necessitate the conclusions. All right. However, we can test each premise to judge its truthfulness, and then we can say the conclusions are more likely truthful than not. And I think this is a generally good argument. And I think if you dive into the teleological argument, if it's something that you really want to pursue, it hasn't been my thing. I'm not really a science guy, and there's much more science involved in this type of argument. Arguments from design are usually involved in teleological arguments. There's been so much research done on the intricacy and the designs of the human body at the cellular level or even beyond. There's so much information out there about how just even parts of our own body, like our eye, it's the part of the body that it just speaks of design. And so this is an argument that you could really dive deep into, and you could test the different premises of human art. The first premise, human artifacts are products of human design. Really, there's no one testing there, but there are definitely people who test that second premise. The universe resembles an artifact. Well, does it? A lot of people think that the universe is just random, that it just showed up over an amount of time and matter and chance, and you mix that all together and you got some kind of primordial soup that has evolved into what we have today. So that's a real premise that can be challenged, where the evidentialist is actually really helpful in bringing about evidence for an argument like this. Again, the first conclusion, and this right here, I've got my mouse on there. Therefore, the universe is a product of intelligent design. We would call that a first conclusion in an argument. People would test that to say, do we really want to say that the universe is a product of intelligent design? And then again, we've got this third premise here: the universe is complex in comparison to human artifacts. Well, just how complex is it? There's all kinds of research that goes into demonstrating the complexity of the universe over what we can achieve as human beings. And so this is a really neat argument. It's a good argument. It has a lot of following today, especially in our scientific age, where people are more interested in presenting evidence. Philosophers don't use this argument as much. It's more of the science evidentialists that really attach themselves to this argument. But I think it's a good argument. It's worth exploring. And now you know what it is. It talks about purpose or design behind the making of the universe and why it's there. So any questions about this argument and what it entails? All right, good deal. So our third argument, now this is one where people usually get confused, and it's that's okay. It's called the ontological argument. Ontology, if you took my worldview class before, it has more to do with the philosophy of being. So when we talk about people have worldviews, well, they usually have an ontology involved in that worldview, and it talks about, you know, how we exist, or what is the nature of our being and stuff like that. So it's not a major part of a worldview, but it exists in there. So this ontological argument was first formulated by Anselm of Canterbury. That's in the 11th century. So he wanted to give a rational explanation for what he believed by faith. Now, if you go and you research Christian theology, especially before the Reformation, there are, especially in ideas of general revelation, special revelation, the coming together of faith and reason, there are going to be three major figures you look at. They all start with A. The first is Augustine, the second is Anselm, and the third is Aquinas. Anselm maybe not be as high up there as Augustine and Aquinas, but he is up there. He was a great philosopher. His philosophical and theological approach to how he thought has a lot of influence on the Reformation, and also it still influences us today in how we do theology. But he was very much Augustinian in how he approached the knowledge of God. He definitely believed that we take certain things by faith, and then we have to work those things out better through our rational faculties, through our reasoning. And so he created this argument on how he could really provide a philosophical proof for the existence of God. But what you're going to notice pretty quickly is that this argument is a little different than the previous two, and I'll explain why. But his argument goes like this. It says, God is by definition the greatest conceivable being. I don't think we can argue that, especially from a Christian point of view. We understand God to be the greatest conceivable being. He is the greatest thing that we can conceive of. And when I get to, and just as a teaser, when I get to the last week in our class here, I'm going to talk about kind of a method I've coined as the conception of God method. Anselm has a huge influence on that method. So God is by definition the greatest conceivable being. If one can conceive of a being greater than God, then that being would be God. So, and we do this all the time theologically. We are corrected in our theology all the time because we think one thing about God, and then we are revealed something in scripture or through a process of reasoning or talking with our peers. We understand that God is greater than we actually understood him to be before. And so we have a better and clearer understanding of God. All right. So by definition, God is the greatest conceivable being. If one can conceive of a being greater than God, then that being that we are conceiving is actually God. A God who exists in the actual world is greater than a God who exists in mind only. So what he's saying is, if you have one person who believes in just in an idea of God, that there's no actual God who exists, but just kind of thinks of God as a concept of a mind. Well, a God who exists in the actual world, say for a second person who believes in an actual real living God, the real living God that exists in the actual world is greater than a God who exists in mind only, because things that actually exist are always greater than things that exist in mind only. That's the truth with really anything. If I've got a cup of tea sitting next to me, and if I imagine a cup of tea, well, that's nice, but it's always better to have the actual thing than just the thing in the mind itself. And so what Anselm is getting at here is that when we think of God, it's not enough just to think of God in the mind, but it's always better to think of God as actually existing. And then he does something really neat here. God must exist in reality, therefore God exists. Now, this is where a lot of people start to jump off and get confused. So Anselm, his whole definition God is the greatest conceivable being. We understand that by definition. If one can conceive of a greater being than God, then that greater being is actually God. All right. A God who exists in the actual world is a God who is greater than a God who exists in mind only. So those first two premises, or that second and third premise, they kind of go hand in hand. All right. If one can conceive of a greater being than God, then that being would be God. It is greater to think of God as actually existing than only existing in the mind. Therefore, God must exist in reality because it is greater. It is greater for God to exist in reality than in the mind only. Therefore, God exists. Now, this is a little bit of an intellectual exercise, but what has been shown from this argument, and it's kind of hard to understand, but this is really a good argument. This has stood this test of time. It's older than most of the arguments that we have out there. It's older than the cosmological argument. It's older than the teleological argument, and it is still used today by philosophers. In fact, both Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig, they have a revised version of this argument that they have published in the last 20 years. And so this is a very influential argument. It's been well received, and it's stood the test of time, and it has a few things that make it a little different than the other arguments. And that's on my next slide, but I wanted to pause here real quick before I go there. Is there anyone who's having trouble with this argument, or is there anything that I can explain about it because I know this is usually the argument that is the most difficult to understand. So are there any questions about it?
Hey, Ben.
Yeah.
So I'm just reading down through these arguments.
Mhm.
And maybe I'm in an audience by myself here. So how do you get to the conclusion that God must exist in reality with the three previous arguments?
Because a God who exists in reality is greater than a God who exists in mind only. Does that make sense?
Hold on.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's tough because
No, I mean I'm seeing where it's going. I'm just trying to because you start with the first one, he's the greatest conceivable being. So are we making the assumption, because we're not making the assumption in the first argument that he exists, are we? Because then we're begging the question down below.
in which
And the first, God is by definition the greatest conceivable being. So
well, okay, let me jump to the next slide, because I think that might help. Hold on. Let me this might answer your question a little more, David. So with some continued information, some things to consider about this argument is that this is an argument from God rather than to
okay,
God.
all right.
Does that
that's
make
fair.
Does that help?
That's fair.
Yeah. So so it's not the same as the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument is using evidence to attempt to build a case for the existence of God. You are absolutely correct in that we are starting from the assumption that God exists in the ontological argument. However, as we've shown throughout this course, we're not unjustified in believing that. And so this almost works like a presuppositional argument. It's a pretty good argument when you see it in that light. So does that answer your question, David?
Go back to the previous slide, if you would.
Yeah.
I apologize, everyone. Just give me a second here.
You're fine.
So.
We're working through this stuff together.
Yeah, I mean, if you're arguing from as opposed to to, this makes sense. I think maybe I thought that's what you were doing, was making an argument to the existence of God. And then if that's the case, I would have trouble with the argument necessarily on the surface. Because in the last statement, therefore God exists. And then I guess you could go back up to the starting point, right?
Mm-hmm.
He exists, he's the greatest conceivable being. So do you find this at all circular?
I don't think so, because the way that it's presented in Anselm, if you actually, he writes two pieces. One's called the oh gosh, I can't remember their names, their Latin names, but the second one, I can't remember the first one. It starts with an M. The second one is called the Proslogion, and pretty much what it's written as a dialogue between two people, between a teacher and a student. Anselm is the teacher, and he's talking to his student. And he said, and pretty much how he says it is that, all right, if you believed in God, and you believe that he truly did exist, by definition, we would have to say that he is the greatest conceivable being. And the student says, well, yes, if the Christian God is the one true God, then yes, because what I understand about the Christian God to be true, then yes, he is the greatest conceivable being. So I wouldn't say it's circular. It's arguing from a presupposition that God is the greatest conceivable being. Now, you may have people that challenge that presupposition and that, but it's pretty logically airtight if you can get people to say, yes, if God exists from, a Christian perspective, then yes, he is the greatest conceivable being. And so I don't know if I would call it circular. There might be some circularity in there. It's just it's a tougher argument to understand, because you are arguing from a really a Christian presupposition that God is the greatest conceivable being.
Right. Okay.
Any other questions, guys? That's a great question. So on this second slide, some considerations. Yes, this is an argument from God rather than to God. We base this argument on the presupposition that God exists and that he is the greatest conceivable being. However, in that argument, we can show logically that God does exist because we understand what it means to be the greatest conceivable being. Theologically, this argument actually fits better with the God of the Bible compared to our other arguments. When we use the cosmological argument or the teleological argument, or even the moral argument that I'm going to show you here in a minute, that doesn't necessitate a biblical God. It doesn't necessitate the God of the Bible being the creator of the universe. It could be some other example. It points to it. It points to that being the Christian God, but it doesn't really necessitate, those arguments don't necessarily mean we have to arrive at a Christian God. And that's one of the drawbacks of those other arguments. This argument gets us much closer to that because it talks about a perfect being. It talks about the greatest conceivable thing. There are theological things that we can take from the Bible that work well with this argument. This argument also led to a branch of theology that we would call perfect being theology. Now, if you go through like our classes on theology here at Sacred Mission, where we talk about the attributes of God, we talk about God's omniscience, his omnipresence, his all these other omni things about him and how he is perfect in these things. We really start to see theology and the history of theology really narrow down about God's perfection from Anselm's work. Anselm contributed to this greatly. And so this is something that the argument offers us is that we really start to understand God. And it's not like they didn't understand God as a perfect being before, but Anselm helps set the tone even more of how we understand God as a perfect being. And this argument is used almost exclusively by Christians because it gets us closer to the Christian God more than any other argument. I cannot think of examples of, and I do have a limited capacity and knowledge of it. I'm not an expert in the ontological argument by any means, but I cannot think of any other philosophers, whether historic or contemporary, that are using this argument within other theistic religions. But I do know of examples like the cosmological argument. It has a Islamic iteration called the Kalam cosmological argument, and so that's something that William Lane Craig actually used in his studies. That he looked to Islamic philosophers and how they formulated the argument. Um, you really don't get that with the ontological argument. It's much more closely related theologically to Christianity. But I think that's because it's an argument from God rather than to God. And so that's the ontological argument. It can be a little tricky. Some people are suspicious of it when they first encounter it. But I promise you, if you really, especially if you go and you look through Ron Nash, if you read his book and listen to his podcast when he taught this, it is really it's a really good argument, and it really helps your faith too, I think, because it's starting from a position of faith and it seeks to explain things about God from a position of faith by using our reason. So any more questions about the ontological argument before I move on? We are going to finish early, which is good. So the last argument that I want to go over tonight is the moral argument, and if you remember back to the agenda at the beginning, the moral argument and its form, it's because, and I put and its form on there because you can substitute other things into this argument. This is a simple argument, and I would recommend probably you want to become most familiar with this argument. If these are all new to you, this is an argument to become most familiar with first because it's so powerful, yet it's so simple to understand. So this is a simple argument, and it's primarily used in C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. So you may have not picked up on that if you've read Mere Christianity before, but he uses the moral argument. And so if you haven't read that before, go back, go read it. If you missed this argument in there, go back and read it again because that's what he's talking about a lot in his book. But the argument hinges on objective morality, which is a morality that is independent of human belief and perspective. All right. So when someone uses the term objective morality, that doesn't mean a morality that is created by culture, has been, created by the church or any kind of institution. It's talking about objective moral standards that exist independent of our own beliefs, our own perspectives, our own experiences, all of those. It's objective morality is not concerned with our experiences as a defining factor of what it means to be objective. However, the argument hinges on there being objective morality, and I'll show you how this works. So, for an objective moral standard to exist, God must exist. So, if you were using the moral argument, what you would say is, if objective morality exists out there in the world today, then God must exist. All right, because he is the one who gives us that moral standard. An objective moral standard does exist. All right, therefore, God exists. Very simple argument. It is inductive. All right, we can challenge both of those premises. However, it's very simple and it's very compelling, might I add. All you have to say is, if you believe, and you could do this in conversation, you can ask a person, hey, do you believe in objective morality, that there is morality out there, that there are things that are right and wrong irrespective of how we feel about them, about how we make the laws. Are there things out there? Is it always wrong anywhere and everywhere to murder a person? If a person says, "Oh yeah, there are moral standards like this," well, if there are moral standards like this, then um, for those to exist, then God must exist. So you say that there are objective moral standards. For those moral standards to exist, God must exist. Therefore, God does exist. And it's a very easy argument to use like that. And I kind of used it backwards there, but you get kind of the idea of that argument. Now people challenge it, and they do all the time. There used to be challenges more so that were aimed at the second premise. An objective moral standard does exist. People all the time will challenge that. No, morality is not objective. It is contextual. It's created by our culture, whatnot. Those are pretty easy to overcome. And you could just use very crazy circumstances, like, oh well, so it's okay for me to if I have a culture where it says murder is okay, then it's okay there. People generally have trouble with that, although not all of them do. You have to find the moral problem that really pushes the buttons of the person that you're dealing with, and get them to admit or get them to prove to you that objective moral standards don't exist. They usually can't do it. All right, so a lot of people used to focus on this second premise. However, recently in philosophy, more people have focused on this first premise, that for an objective moral standard to exist, God must exist. And what they have done is philosophers have now started to say, really within the last 20 years, that there is objective morality, but God, you don't need God to have objective morality. And if you want to learn more about that, I know that William Lane Craig has involved himself in numerous debates. You can easily get on YouTube and look up debates by Craig about objective morality, and you'll find atheist philosophers who believe in the objective moral standards, but they don't believe God, made those standards. They don't believe that those standards exist, from God as a how do I want to say it, as an attribute of His person. So before, you would see people attack the second premise more so, and that's kind of been done away with. Now people are attacking the first premise primarily. But this is a good argument. This is a powerful argument. It's something that any of us can use, and it's something that usually we can talk to people about, and we can use it in basic conversation, and we can really steer that conversation into some deep dialogue with this argument. Now, when I talked about the forms earlier, what I meant was that we can use the form of this argument and substitute many things into the argument. If we don't want to use morality, for example, we can use other things like beauty or truth. So if I wanted to make this the argument about truth, I could say for an objective moral, or for an objective standard of truth to exist, God must exist. An objective standard of truth does exist, therefore God exists. I can do it with beauty as well. For an objective standard of beauty to exist, God must exist. An objective standard of beauty does exist, therefore God exists. You can substitute other ideas, other, I want to say, attributes of God almost into this, where people might latch onto them, and you can use this same form of the argument to really argue for the existence of God. And that's something that I know that Augustine used a form of this argument to argue for objective truth, to show God's existence. And we see that C.S. Lewis used this forcefully in the 20th century to argue from objective morality to God. And so this is something that we can all use. If you've never heard these arguments before, and you want to know where should I start, I would say this is the first one to start with. Learn this as fast as you can, learn how to use it in conversation, and then put it to use and substitute moral standards with other things like standards of truth, standards of beauty, etc. So that is the moral argument in a nutshell. Does anybody have any questions about it? And I believe that's the end of our class tonight. Anybody have any questions about anything really? Wow, good deal. Okay. Well, I will take that as you guys are understanding everything about what we're arguing tonight. Now, one of the things I do want to mention before hopping off here, there are many other arguments out there. I've only listed the 4 that I think are you're most likely to run into in every other apologetic text out there. If you, again, I'll say it, I've said it before, all those books that I mentioned a few weeks ago, Frame's book on apologetics, Nash's book on faith and reason, Craig's book on faith and reason. What was the other one? And Doug Groothius apologetics book that they made us use at Liberty for introduction to apologetics. These all talk about these 4 arguments, but they also talk about more arguments. Some of those arguments are a little more complex. They're a little less convincing in my opinion, but there are other arguments out there. Don't limit yourself to just these 4 arguments that I've presented to you tonight. Go ahead and get yourself out there and research some of the other arguments. Look them up, see if they work for you, because they can be both edifying to your person, to your faith, as well as useful tools in order to help bring people closer to Christ. So again, don't just think that these are the only 4 arguments that exist. I'm really just trying to whet your appetite to get into more arguments. So last chance, if there are any other questions, ask them. But next week we will be looking at miracles. Make sure you read the David Hume essay. And are there any questions before I sign off tonight, guys? All right, good deal. Well, hey guys, thank you so much again. We're done a few minutes early. I look forward to going through these next few weeks with you, and stay strong, and we will get through this together. You all have a great night, okay?
Good night, folks.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks, Ben. Yep, you too, man.